I had less than $200 in my bank account. My rent was already a week late, and this morning the landlord taped a bright red warning notice right on my apartment door. I was 24 years old back then, fresh out of college with a bachelor's degree and a crushing mountain of student debt on my shoulders. I was lucky enough to land a short-term contract position at an old run-down medical building on the outskirts of Chicago. My job was to audit and reorganize a massive backlog of paper medical records that had been piling up for decades. The brutal pressure of just trying to survive exhausted me completely. Every lunch break, I could do nothing but sit with my knees pulled up to my chest inside my battered old car, with no appetite to eat, just crying hopelessly, because I didn't know how I was going to make it through the month. If I didn't finish that mountain of paperwork on time, my contract would be terminated, and I would be out on the street. The working environment in that medical building was suffocating, with a stark, rigid hierarchy of power. Low-level contract workers like me were always the most vulnerable targets, forced to take all the pressure and comply with management if we wanted any chance of a contract extension. At that time, my mind was completely disoriented and lost. I was so drained that I was ready to grab onto any hand reached out to me, ready to accept any outside intervention or help, as long as it kept me holding on to my only lifeline. Everything officially began on a late evening when I was sitting with my head buried in a mountain of old medical records in the office kitchen. I remember I was wiping away my tears with my sleeve when a middle-aged man walked in. He wore a gray suit that was impeccably tailored, exuding the elegance and power of an upper management executive. That was the first time I met Sterling, the head of the building's management. Sterling didn't ask me why I was crying. He just silently walked over, personally brewed a hot cup of coffee, and pushed it toward me along with a thick envelope. "Fix whatever is worrying you, Alana," he said in a calm, low, and deeply warm voice. "You're too young to look that tired." Inside the envelope was a cash bonus that was more than enough for me to pay off my late rent and buy groceries for the entire month. I tried to refuse right away, but Sterling just smiled and told me to consider it an advance on the contributions I was going to make here. Just a week later, Sterling used his influence to specially approve a full-time contract for me, with a salary that was double my initial starting rate. He officially became my direct mentor in a massive auditing project. Because Sterling was much older than me, I quickly grew to look up to him like a father figure, a solid anchor in the middle of this unfamiliar city. Sterling taught me how to navigate complex medical record clauses and showed me how to deal with the difficult doctors in the building. He frequently treated me to expensive lunches at upscale restaurants to discuss my future career goals. I truly believed that I was the luckiest person in the world to be chosen and protected by someone as powerful as Sterling. That overwhelming gratitude and absolute trust caused me to completely lower my guard, willingly placing myself in a state of psychological dependence on him without ever realizing that I was stepping straight into a carefully prepared trap. My dependence on Sterling grew with each passing week, but I didn't even notice it. After I signed the official contract, he transferred me to work permanently in the paper medical records archive room. This room was located deep down in the third basement level, a place completely cut off from everything, with thick concrete walls on all four sides and zero cell service. Every day I walked down there, it felt like I was completely disconnected from the outside world. Sterling began to interfere deeper into my life under the guise of being a caring manager. He would personally buy and bring expensive lunches down to the archive room for me every single day. "I don't want my best employee eating cheap canned food from the outside," he would always say with a warm smile. Later, Sterling started gifting me expensive designer office outfits. When I hesitated to accept because the gifts were too luxurious, his face would instantly change, and he would say my old clothes looked too simple and didn't fit the professional image he was building for me. I had no choice but to accept, because I didn't want to upset the person who had saved my life. But the personal boundaries between us began to blur in a terrifying way. Sterling knew the schedule of the bus routes around this area with creepy accuracy. Whenever I finished packing up my things and was about to leave the room to catch the bus, he would always appear right outside the archive room door at that exact moment. He would lean against the iron door frame, staring intently at me, and ask in a probing voice, "Alana, do you have any plans tonight? Are you going to meet anyone outside of work hours?" Those controlling questions about my private life became more and more frequent. It was no longer the concern of a boss for his employee. It felt like an invisible surveillance suffocating me down in that dark basement. I started to realize the anomalies and looked for ways to protect myself. Late one afternoon, while I was sorting through sealed archive boxes from 10 years ago down in the basement, I accidentally stumbled upon a forgotten personnel file. It was the file of my predecessor, a girl who had suddenly quit without any clear reason. Inside that brown manila folder were papers that made the blood freeze in my veins. They were restraining orders from the Cook County Court against Sterling for severe stalking and sexual harassment directed at that girl. Attached to them were a series of secretly taken photos and threatening messages in Sterling's own handwriting. Absolute terror washed over me, and I understood that I wasn't some lucky girl being mentored, but rather the next target of a predator. "I have to get out of here right now," I whispered into the darkness of the archive room. The very next day, I started drawing boundaries and tried to keep my distance from Sterling. When he brought over an expensive lunchbox like usual, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Thank you, boss, but from now on, I'll be bringing my own food. I'm on a strict diet." I also flat out refused a designer handbag he left on my desk, and at the same time, I requested to be moved up to the general office on the 4th floor to easily communicate with other departments. My rejection immediately triggered the dark side of Sterling. His polite, elegant smile vanished, replaced by a cold, flat expression and eyes as sharp as a razor. He stepped forward, backing me into the corner of the wall, and spoke in a deep, threatening tone. "Alana, you should remember who pulled you out of that mud of debt. Who do you think you are to turn your back on me? Don't be an ungrateful brat. It won't be good for your future." The fear turned into sheer panic when the protective system around me completely collapsed. I gathered all my courage and took the predecessor's file, along with the evidence, up to the Human Resources Department to report Sterling. But the HR manager just looked at the pile of papers, sighed, and pushed them back toward me with a hesitant look. "Sterling is the largest shareholder in this building's management board. His family funded all the medical equipment here," she said in a cold voice. "My sincere advice to you is to keep quiet and keep working. If you make a scene out of this, you will never get a job at any medical facility in Chicago again." Realizing that this organization only prioritized protecting those in power, I knew I was completely on my own. I went back to my office, wrote a brief resignation letter, left it on the desk, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the building that very afternoon. I blocked Sterling's phone number, blocked his social media accounts, and told myself that this horrific nightmare was finally over. I was completely wrong to think that leaving that place would bring me peace. For the next 2 weeks, Sterling began stalking me in the real world in a completely open and blatant manner. Every single night as midnight approached, his luxury black SUV would appear and park silently at the corner of the street directly opposite my bedroom window. Sterling didn't do anything at all. He just sat inside his car with the cabin light turned on and stared intently at my house for hours on end. The dangerous escalation reached its absolute peak at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning during a violent rainstorm. I was startled awake by a loud crack of thunder when I suddenly heard a distinct, repeated clicking sound coming from my back door. Someone was using a tool to pick the door lock and was actively trying to break inside. In a state of sheer, overwhelming panic, my mind went instantly to Sterling, and I realized that if I stayed in this house, I would die. I hurriedly grabbed my car keys, rushed out the front door, started the engine, and sped away into the blinding curtain of rain. The only thought driving me at that moment was finding a way to expose that old man's true face before the law. I remembered that the mini audio recorder containing the entire conversation of Sterling, threatening me, that day was still left behind inside the desk drawer in the basement archive room. That was the absolute piece of evidence that could allow the police to arrest him immediately. I frantically drove back to the old medical building and used my employee badge, which hadn't been deactivated yet, to sneak inside through the back entrance. The space inside the medical building at night was completely dark and as silent as a deserted tomb. I rushed down the concrete steps, heading straight toward the medical records archive room, located deep within the 3rd basement level. The moment I stepped inside the suffocating room and finally located the audio recorder, a harsh, heavy thud echoed right behind me. The thick iron door of the archive room was suddenly slammed shut and locked completely from the outside. I lunged forward, banging violently against the small glass window on the iron door, and looked out into the pitch-black hallway. Sterling was standing right there, his gray suit completely drenched in rainwater, his face twisted into a warped, deformed smile under the dim, flickering light. "Alana, I told you that you could never run away from me." His voice echoed through the gap in the iron door, sounding as cold as grinding metal. "I didn't follow you home at all. I knew you would eventually come back here to get this thing." He held up the door key and slowly slipped it deep into his coat pocket. Right at that exact second, from the deepest, darkest corner behind the iron shelves of the archive room, a strange noise rang out. It was the unmistakable sound of iron chains clanking and dragging across the concrete floor. Accompanied by a heavy, wild panting, a gaunt figure with tattered clothes and completely disheveled hair slowly crawled out from the shadows. It was my predecessor, the girl who had been officially reported as missing for a very long time. Her eyes were completely vacant and crazed. Her ankles were chained tightly to a structural concrete pillar of the building, and she was charging straight toward me with a wild, frantic shriek like a starved beast. I screamed out in terror, backing away into the corner and using every ounce of my strength to fight back as she lunged to claw and tear at me. Just when I thought I was going to be torn to pieces inside this basement, a high-powered flashlight suddenly beamed directly through the glass window. The heavy iron door was violently pried open by the police, using a crowbar after a few massive hits. It turned out that the neighbor at my apartment complex had immediately called the police when they saw a figure picking my back door lock, and the officers had tracked the GPS device on Sterling's car straight to this location. 4 police officers burst into the room, quickly pinning Sterling down onto the concrete floor and locking his hands with a pair of handcuffs. A female officer rushed over to hug me tightly, covering my eyes as the other officers began using bolt cutters to snap the chains for the poor girl. As Sterling was escorted away, his face showed absolutely no sign of fear. He only looked back at me with a gaze full of deep regret and disappointment. Sterling was later put on trial and received a sentence of life imprisonment for false imprisonment, stalking, and intentional injury. However, that victory could never heal what had been completely broken inside of me. Many months have passed now, but I still suffer from incredibly heavy psychological trauma and require long-term therapy. I have completely lost all trust in social relationships, looking at everyone around me with nothing but suspicion and intense wariness. I might be physically safe now, but my mind is still completely trapped down in that dark third basement level whenever the night falls. Two years of hard work in a peaceful suburban district finally paid off. I received a promotion to the position of EMT shift supervisors, but that joy did not last very long. To accept this new position, I was forced to transfer to EMS Station 4. It was an infamous area located right in the heart of downtown Detroit. This place always led the city in crime rates, and the workload pressure was suffocating. I walked into the new station with a very excited mindset. I expected to apply national standardized protocols to our daily operations. I wanted to improve response times and coordination between the ambulance crews during the night shift. But my very first orientation day threw a bucket of cold water over me. The atmosphere inside the station was so stifling that it was hard to breathe. I quickly realized that I was falling into a structural trap. I had legitimate authority on paper, but I completely lacked actual power here. The old staff did not bother to welcome me at all. The shift crew looked at me with judging and incredibly cold eyes. That situation forced me to depend entirely on the station manager to establish my position. I needed him to help me gain the absolute minimum recognition from my new coworkers. My title as shift supervisor was completely isolated at this point. It was just a worthless line of text on an administrative document that had never been tested by fire. My first night shift began with an awkward and tense introduction. The station manager led me to a tall, heavily built man. He introduced him with a voice full of admiration and pride. "This is Gideon, our veteran paramedic and driver. He is the absolute star of the night shifts here." I took a step forward, trying to force the friendliest smile I could manage. I extended my hand to initiate a proper introduction. "Hey Gideon, I'm the new shift supervisor. I'm really looking forward to working with you on these nights." But Gideon completely ignored my gesture. He didn't even bother to glance down at my extended hand. Gideon just let out a low, deeply contemptuous grunt from the back of his throat. Then, he turned his back on me and walked away right in front of the station manager. That left me standing there frozen in the middle of the room with my hand hovering in the air. That was the exact moment I realized a parallel power structure existed in this place. I might hold the official authority on administrative papers and legal documents, but Gideon was the one who held the actual power over life and death once the ambulance hit the streets of Detroit. During the very next hours of the shift, Gideon began his campaign to sabotage my operational control. He completely ignored every single dispatch order coming through my supervisor radio. He secretly turned off the internal GPS tracking system mounted on the ambulance so I couldn't monitor him. Gideon intentionally took wrong routes and long detours when we received emergency calls to high-crime hotspots. The consequences of his actions hit us immediately, and it was devastating. A critical stroke patient missed their golden window for medical emergency care simply because our ambulance arrived late. The doctors at the trauma hospital were furious and screamed at us over the phone. As the supervisor on duty, I had to step up, take all the heat, and handle the formal apology. After 4 agonizing hours of working in complete isolation, I decided I had to do something. I caught Gideon by the back door of the parking lot just as we were about to clock out. I kept my voice calm, trying to break the ice and de-escalate the tension. "Gideon, look, I don't know if I did something to offend you, or if I stepped on your toes, but I really want us to keep things professional." Gideon stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his head to look directly at me. His eyes rolled back and wide open in an exaggerated, deeply unsettling manner. Without a single warning, Gideon suddenly opened his mouth and screamed right into my face. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a pure, unhinged roar of rage. The sound blasted into my ears from just inches away, causing me to completely freeze. Immediately after, he shoved the heavy metal door open with brute force, stormed out to his car, and sped away. The next morning, I walked into the station completely exhausted both physically and mentally. A day shift coworker secretly pulled me into a blind spot behind the filing cabinets. He looked around nervously to make sure absolutely no one was listening. He whispered a harsh, brutal truth right into my ear. The station manager treated Gideon as if he were his own flesh and blood. It was a total unconditional favoritism that had been going on for years. Gideon genuinely believed that he was the one who actually ran this EMS Station 4. The real reason for his intense, unhinged hatred finally came to light. Gideon had been eyeing the night shift EMT supervisor position for a very long time, but management decided to promote me instead, an outsider from a different district. Because he was passed over for the promotion, he directed all his rage toward me. At first, I tried to find a shred of empathy for Gideon. It definitely sucks to lose an advancement opportunity to someone else. But over the next few weeks, that little bit of compassion completely vanished. Gideon didn't just stop at basic rudeness and hostility. He started displaying incredibly dangerous behaviors during our shifts. I discovered a horrifying secret about Gideon during our late-night runs. He routinely took advantage of unconscious, homeless patients to steal cash from their wallets. Even worse, he secretly pocketed high-dose narcotics from the ambulance's controlled medical inventory. I knew I couldn't stay silent about this serious criminal activity. I gathered all the facts and immediately reported the situation to the station manager. I thought this would be the end of the line for Gideon because he broke the law and threatened a supervisor. But the manager's reaction completely stunned me. He just let out a heavy sigh and threw a look of pure annoyance at me. "Look, Gideon is the best paramedic we have at this station. He is the only one who can smoothly handle the chaos of the night shifts. You are new here, so it's just easier if you learn to shut up and follow his lead." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "I am his official supervisor," I said. "He is stealing narcotics, and he just openly threatened to physically assault me." The station manager waved his hand and cut me off with a cold, dismissive tone. "It's just easier for everyone. If you back off and let him have his way, don't make this a big deal." That was the exact moment I bitterly realized I was completely on my own in this system. The internal control mechanisms and medical ethical codes had totally collapsed. The manager was never going to take my side. In fact, if Gideon actually harmed me, this system would probably cover it up. There were no shared rules left, and no neutral arbiter to step in. I had to figure out how to survive on my own against a psychopath backed by the organization. Gideon began shifting from subtle psychological sabotage to open physical intimidation. He repeatedly screamed at terrified patients and threw medical gear across the ambulance. He intentionally slammed heavy IV equipment and glass vials onto the floor of the vehicle. His behavior was becoming completely unhinged and impossible to predict or control. The fateful night arrived. When we were dimming the interior lights to inventory our controlled narcotics, the ambulance was parked in the darkest, most isolated corner of the entire station lot. Gideon shattered a heavy glass bottle on the floor right next to my boots. He stood over me, aggressively clicking a large pair of heavy metal trauma shears in his hand. The metallic snapping sound echoed repeatedly through the small space as a direct challenge to my presence. When I firmly asked him to step back so I could complete the mandated drug log, Gideon completely snapped. He was a very large, imposing man who easily had a foot of height and 50 pounds on me. Gideon suddenly lunged, throwing his entire physical weight directly into my personal space. The force of his movement sent me stumbling backward, my spine hitting the metal oxygen rack hard. His face was completely crimson with rage, and the veins in his neck were bulging intensely. He pinned me against the wall of the ambulance, breathing his hot, furious breath right into my face. "Back off. I am serious." "You really don't want to see what I can do to you?" I immediately raised both of my hands up to my chest with my palms open and visible. I chose not to say a single word because I knew any response would trigger his physical violence. I carefully slid my body sideways through the narrow gap along the stretcher to escape his reach. I bolted straight into the front driver's cabin and locked the heavy security door behind me. I collapsed onto the driver's seat, my legs shaking like jelly as I desperately tried to slow my breathing. After that horrifying night, I knew I could no longer rely on anyone but myself. For the next 2 weeks, I carried a small notebook with me everywhere I went. I covertly documented the exact date, time, and details of every single threat from Gideon. I recorded every available witness at the station and every single operational violation he committed. I patiently built an objective case based purely on factual evidence, keeping my emotions completely out of it. Once I had compiled enough documentation, I issued an ultimatum to the station manager. I demanded a formal meeting with the direct involvement of the district manager. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep at all and spent hours rehearsing exactly what I was going to say. I arrived at the EMS station at 5 minutes to 2 in the afternoon the next day. As I was walking down the hallway toward the office, the door suddenly swung open. Gideon stepped out of the room, showing absolutely no sign of fear or remorse. He looked me straight in the eyes and let out a smug, victorious smirk. His gaze told me everything I needed to know, that I had lost before the meeting even started. I walked into the office and saw the station manager and the district manager already sitting there. I placed my notebook packed with evidence firmly down on the desk. I have everything documented right here. The threats of physical assault and the theft of controlled narcotics by Gideon. But the district manager didn't even bother to touch my notebook. He coldly raised his hand to signal me to stop talking. "We are not interested in hearing anything more about this matter. We have already spoken with Gideon, and we trust his side of the story completely. Management feels that you are simply not a good fit for the unique environment of this station." I stood there frozen in disbelief, looking from my journal to the expressionless faces of the two men. I realized right then that nothing I said or proved was ever going to matter. The system had chosen to eliminate the whistleblower to protect the organization's public image. I didn't argue, and I didn't utter a single angry word. I quietly picked up my notebook, turned around, and walked right out of the building. I submitted my resignation that very afternoon and swore never to return to the emergency medical field again. I packed my things, moved to a completely different town far away from Detroit, and enrolled in a brand new degree program. I tried my best to bury those horrific night shift memories and move on with my life. Everything seemed to be left in the past until one day a few months ago. As I was scrolling through my social media feed, I stopped dead in my tracks at a photo posted by an old friend. In the picture, Gideon was leaning back against a police patrol car. He was wearing a full law enforcement uniform with a service pistol holstered on his hip. Pinned to his chest was a shiny metal badge. Gideon still had that exact same smug, victorious smile from the day he walked out of that office meeting. Gideon is a cop now, the person who sabotaged medical protocols, stole narcotics, and threatened my life now walks around with a gun. He is out on the streets, wielding the supreme authority of the law in his hands. I have been stuck in this tax archive room for the past 4 years. It is located deep in the basement of an old office building in Philadelphia, completely isolated. The air down here is suffocating, thick with the smell of moldy paper and entirely cut off from sunlight. My shift starts at 6 in the evening and ends at 2 in the morning. By then, everyone upstairs has gone home, leaving only a dark and isolated basement space. But the pressure of dry data is not the most terrifying thing. What truly breeds unease every night is Gideon. He is the only coworker who shares the late shift with me. Gideon is a complete enigma to everyone in the company. He is eccentric, closed off, never speaks, and always moves silently like a ghost. A few months ago, I began to notice an underground surveillance mechanism established by Gideon himself. He sits at the opposite desk, half hidden behind a large concrete pillar that partially blocks the view. Whenever I get up to get water, use the restroom, or just look away from my screen, I feel his eyes on me. It is a fixed, blank stare, unblinking and incredibly cold. The thing is, the moment I snap my head around to confront him, Gideon immediately looks down. He pulls a small, black leather notebook from his pocket and quickly writes something inside. He repeats this tracking behavior frantically, day after day. I once mentioned this to a few day shift employees. They just laughed out loud and said Gideon was a harmless weirdo, trying to find odd entertainment in this boring basement. People even turned his quirk into cheap jokes to relieve work stress. How many pages did your personal spy log today? They often mocked me like that whenever it was time for the shift handover. That complacency and laughter created a fatal blind spot in my mind. I ignored every unusual warning sign from this coworker. I accepted his twisted stalking behavior as a normalized, unwritten rule of the office. I had absolutely no idea that, under the indulgence of the isolated night shift, the man sitting a few feet away from me was silently building absolute control over my very life. Everything started going off the rails on a late Thursday night. I was in a rush to finish the last batch of tax files when I accidentally spilled my half-empty coffee cup onto the desk. The dark coffee soaked into a few sheets of scratch paper containing some of my personal information and private phone number. Frustrated, I crumpled up the wet papers and tossed them hard into the plastic trash can beneath my feet. Immediately, I heard a loud noise from the opposite side. Gideon stood up abruptly, his swivel chair rolling back and slamming hard against the concrete pillar. He lunged straight toward my aisle with rushed, heavy footsteps. Before I could even realize what was happening, he bent over and shoved both hands into my trash can. He picked up the coffee-soaked scratch paper, gripping it tightly in his palm with a deeply intense look. That frantic action made it seem as though he was reclaiming a priceless treasure that belonged to him. This extreme invasion of my personal space was the final straw. I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back with force, and yelled right in his face. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Gideon? Get away from my desk and get back to yours right now," I snapped in anger, my shout echoing through the empty, suffocating basement space. Gideon didn't argue or explain anything at all. He just slowly took a step back, his hands still tightly clutching those dirty scraps of paper. He looked at me with a blank, soulless stare that carried a chilling threat. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then turned around and walked straight into the restroom at the end of the hallway. The restroom door slammed shut, returning a haunting silence to the entire basement. Once Gideon was out of sight, a mix of deep suspicion and sheer terror drove me to do something incredibly reckless. I looked over at his desk chair. There sat the old, worn-out leather briefcase he always carried with him every night. I walked around the concrete pillar, my heart pounding in my chest out of fear that he might suddenly return. Trembling, I unlatched my coworker's briefcase. Inside, there were no files, documents, or any company work tools whatsoever. The only thing lying quietly there was a large black scrapbook. I flipped open the first page and felt the blood completely freeze in my veins. The page was covered with my old trash. A strand of hair from my chair, a paper coffee cup sleeve bearing my fingerprints. But the most horrifying part was on the next pages. There were dozens of candid photos taken of me from behind. The pictures captured me walking through dark alleys to get home every night, standing and waiting for the subway, and there were even shots taken from a hidden angle while I was unlocking my apartment door. Beside each photo were neat, handwritten notes, documenting my daily routine down to the exact minute. He knew exactly what time I turned off the lights to go to sleep, and exactly when I usually woke up. A lump caught in my throat, cold sweat drenched my shirt, and I couldn't breathe. I rushed back to my desk, reaching for the intercom phone to call building security upstairs, but only a prolonged, dead static buzzed from the receiver. The basement office intercom had completely lost its signal at some point. Right now, there were only 2 people left in this deep basement, with no way out and no help from anyone. And to my horror, I heard the click of the restroom door lock at the end of the hallway gently turning open. The sound of Gideon's rhythmic footsteps on the tile floor snapped me back to reality. I hurriedly shoved the scrapbook back into his briefcase and stealthily crawled toward my cubicle. Just as I collapsed into my chair, a dry click echoed from the main breaker panel. The entire fluorescent lighting system on the ceiling flickered a few times, and then went completely dark. The basement space instantly plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. The hum of the AC fan died down as well, leaving behind an eerie silence. My computer screen went black, marking the total collapse of the building's security camera system. Trembling, I reached into my pocket to pull out my cell phone, hoping for a life-saving sliver of light. The blue glow from the phone screen shone directly onto my face, which was already drenched in cold sweat. I looked at the top corner of the screen and felt my chest tighten. The signal bar displayed only a single, flat phrase, "No service." Cell reception in this basement was already weak, but now it had completely lost all connection to the outside world. I was entirely isolated, buried alive in a concrete tomb deep underground. Amidst the absolute silence of the night, my ears began to pick up haunting, micro sounds. The restroom door at the end of the hallway let out a soft, agonized creak. Then came the footsteps, shuffling, slow, and perfectly rhythmic footsteps began moving along the rows of desks. That was the sound of Gideon's shoe soles thudding against the cold tile floor. He wasn't rushing at all, showing zero panic over this sudden blackout. He moved with precision, as if he had memorized every single nook and cranny of the office in the dark over the past months. The footsteps stopped at the first row of desks, accompanied by the rustling sound of files being flipped through. He was looking for me. I completely lost the ability to navigate by sight, only able to hold my breath and listen to guess the distance of the danger. I quickly crawled flat beneath my desk, clamping both hands over my mouth to stop my teeth from chattering wildly. The surrounding darkness seemed to tighten, turning the familiar office space into an inescapable death trap. Gideon's footsteps started up again, this time passing the corner of the large concrete pillar opposite me. The sound of his soles dragging lightly across the floor drew closer and closer, less than 2 meters away from my cubicle partition. He stopped right in front of the entrance to my desk. I heard the very faint, steady sound of that man exhaling through his nose right next to me. A sharp click cut through the silence. A small flame erupted from a metal lighter right next to my face. The dim, flickering yellow light revealed Gideon's face peering low under the desk. He was staring intently at me with a twisted smile and wide, psychotic eyes. He didn't rush to attack me immediately. He brought his lips close to my ear and let out whispers in a bone-chilling, flat voice. "I took your house keys last week when you left them on your desk to make a duplicate set." Gideon chuckled softly, a raspy sound tearing through the darkness. He continued to reveal a horrifying truth that left my entire body numb with fear. "Just this afternoon I went to your apartment, replaced all the locks with my own, and prepared a confined space inside to keep you. I realized that all of his bizarre trash-picking, information gathering, and stalking behavior over the past few months were not harmless pranks. They were meticulously calculated steps for a brutal identity theft plot. Starting tomorrow, I will officially take over your entire life, your job, and your identity in this world. And you will completely disappear from this earth without anyone ever knowing." Gideon whispered that sentence as if it were an absolute fact already destined to happen. The flame from the lighter suddenly snapped shut, returning the space to pitch darkness. Instantly, the rustling sound of a briefcase zipper echoed through the night. I heard a large, coarse rope being pulled out, and the click of a box cutter blade being pushed out to its maximum length. He lunged straight under the desk, squeezing my neck tight with his large, powerful hands, and pinning his entire body weight onto me against the cold office floor to rest in a state of sheer panic. I frantically clawed my hands across the desktop. My fingers brushed against the large, heavy steel stapler used for binding tax files. I grabbed it and smashed it repeatedly into the darkness where Gideon's face was pressing down. A blunt thud echoed, followed by his painful, resentful groan. The hands choking my neck suddenly loosened. Using every ounce of strength left, I kicked hard into his chest and scrambled out from under the desk. I ran wildly through the darkness, rushing straight toward the basement's only emergency exit. I slammed both hands repeatedly against the thick iron door, creating loud, deafening thuds that echoed everywhere. "Help me! There's a killer down here!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, tears and panic sweat pouring down my cheeks. Fortunately, a building security guard patrolling the upper hallway on the night shift heard the strange noise. The rattling sound of keys echoed, and the heavy iron door was finally opened from the outside. The moment security and the police rushed into the basement with high-powered flashlights, Gideon had already made his escape. He vanished without a trace through the back door that led straight into a dark, tangled alleyway of the city. The subsequent police investigation uncovered a truth that was far more terrifying. When they searched Gideon's personal locker at the company, they found that his personnel file was completely fraudulent. The man calling himself Gideon had used the identity of someone who had passed away 10 years ago to get the job. The man who had been sitting next to me for months was actually a ghost, completely invisible to the law. I was lucky to survive that horrific night, but my psyche was entirely shattered by the fear. I immediately handed in my resignation and never dared to step foot into that basement office ever again. I packed up all my belongings that very night to move to a completely different city on the West Coast. I spent thousands of dollars installing a dense security camera system and replacing all the smart locks for my new apartment. But the brutal psychological aftershocks still haunt me during my exhausted sleep every night, because I know the absolute truth that the psychopath is still out there, walking free under another fake identity. And whenever I accidentally hear the sharp click of a metal lighter echoing somewhere in the dark, my entire body trembles violently.